our Sunday feature, Walking with Attitude. Psychogeography was invented by the French situationists in the 1950s. In recent years, the word has started turning up in style magazines and colour supplements. What does it mean? The novelist and travel writer Ian Marchant tries to find out.
On the 6th of March 1956, the situationists Guy Debord and Gil Volman came wandering through the 11th arrondissement in search of psychogeographical enlightenment, trying to get lost, trying to defamiliarise themselves with their own city. This is an area that they found repulsively petty bourgeois. On one level, they were just two drunk avant-garde French artists wandering about from bar to bar. On another level, this project has come to be seen as revolutionary, as a completely new way of addressing the city, as a personal project. You reinvent yourself at the same time as the city is reinvented around you. And this, apparently, is psychogeography. Whoa! Red light. Came very close to ending up in a Parisian hospital there. Which would have been a sort of way of getting lost, I guess. For several years now, psychogeography has been a word worth dropping into conversation if you want to impress with your cultural street smarts. More interesting than the oxbow lakes of your own school geography, and more hip than the human geography your own kids do, such as studying footfalls in shopping centres. Psychogeography sounds edgy, which it might be if you could work out what it was. It was invented by situationist Guy Debord, and in Paris I spoke to Debord's biographer, Andrew Hussey.
Debord said that the word came to him when he'd taken some hashish and he was wandering through the Jardin des Plantes, and he was so stoned that he couldn't find his way out, so he decided to stay in the park and explore its inner recesses. So it was a journey into the inner mind as well as the city.
He called it pleasingly vague. Is it too vague? Does it have any meaning at all, do you think?
It does have a meaning. And the idea is that the city, as you wander through it, is endlessly changing as you penetrate the different levels of atmosphere and as those atmospheres have an effect on you. Now, not all of those atmospheres are pleasant. They can be awe, they can be boredom, they can be melancholy. So the vagueness is actually to do with the endlessly fluid nature of the city, which is always moving.
So this is the Rue Oberkampf, and we're heading across the 11th arrondissement. Jolyon, the producer, and I, we're not exactly lost. They were lost. We, weirdly, are following in their footsteps. There are lingerie shops, which is always welcome. But I don't know if my psyche's being changed. That's the thing. That's one of the things I simply don't understand. Who has sufficient access to their consciousness to say, oh, I'm feeling mordant, or, lachrymose or something, as opposed to, oh, I've never been here before. Debord calls somewhere depressingly picturesque, and I find this quite picturesque. Just exactly the sort of charmant little area that you'd boast to your friends about when you go home and say, oh, I don't know if you know the 11th arrondissement. It's marvellous. We found the Rue Oberkampf. So it seemed to them, I guess, deeply inauthentic. Whereas to an English bloke, it seems deeply authentically Parisian.
But what the situationists believed was that we are imprisoned in what they call the society of the spectacle. And where we're standing right here, if I just turn to my left, you can see all the right bank, which is commodity, commerce, the spectacle of consumerism, and they hated all of that. And what they wanted to do was develop techniques, strategies, situations, which were ways of resisting the control of the spectacle in our lives. And if I turn to the right, which actually I'm pointing to the left bank, that was the playground for the situationists, where they practiced this thing called psychogeography.
So what is the spectacle then?
Guy Debord says that everything that once was truly lived has now moved away into representation. And if you think about it, that's true, that we live in a society where we're surrounded by more images, more visual culture than ever before. Now, the idea of the spectacle can be traced back to Paris in the 1850s. When Baron Haussmann reinvented the city with the great boulevards, this was the first modern designer city in the world. You could walk the boulevards and consume with your eyes the spectacle of things that you might want to buy, which could range from a newfangled kettle to a prostitute. Now, the flaneur, the man who wandered through the city in that way, was consuming the spectacle in that way. The situationists kind of turned that on its head, because what they wanted to do was create a way of wandering through the city, the dérive, which means in French the drift, in which you were led by your own unconscious desires rather than desires that were given to you by capitalist economics.
Walking up the Rue Oberkampf, the first thing they liked was at 160, Délicatation Provision et Breton. Bonjour. What's now at 160 Rue Oberkampf is a phone shop called Phonio. And in a way, the phony is what Debord meant by the spectacle, that the spectacle was phony. Was authenticity to do with the working class? I mean, on the dérives, did they meet people? Were they engaging with people?
I think what Debord was interested in was not so much the working class, and he wasn't somebody who was actually going to do a lot of work himself, but what the French historian Louis Chevalier calls les classes dangereuses, the dangerous classes. Revolution is not going to come from the working class, that's all finished, but from the dangerous classes, the outlaws, the sexual transgressors, the misfits, the drunks, the anarchists.
What are we looking for?
I suppose we're looking for dangerous lowlifes like this gentleman here, who's just a kind of old tramp whose head is covered in open sores and a couple of packs of the French equivalent of special brew. And we have turned a corner and there are homeless people and Middle Eastern shops and an abandoned lavatory on the street. But it's still very nice.
They would find themselves in the company of refugees from the Spanish Civil War in a bar in Aubervilliers. They'd find themselves in a place where drugs were sold by Algerians in the 1950s.
Lads playing football. Bonjour.
On passe à la télé?
Ah, non.
C'est la radio.
La radio, oui. Radio Angleterre. I can't really speak French. It's the most French I've ever used. And it doesn't go anywhere, it goes to a hotel. So, you know, we've come out of a dodgy old bit and back into somewhere that one can only describe as repulsively petit bourgeois. Did we meet any dangerous people? I suppose there were some dodgy looking characters. Did we try and buy hashish or opium off them? Not really. Should we have done in order to do the authentic thing? Perhaps we should go back. I think the licence payers might draw the line. Anyway, here we are, Avenue Simon Bolivar. Wonder where we go next. The situationists didn't leave a lot of psychogeographic writing behind, and what they did sometimes seems a bit, well, pedestrian. Debord did produce a couple of psychogeographic maps, where he cut up the map of Paris and stuck it back together in ways that represented psychogeographic reality. I'm a travel writer. I guess I've been trying to track down what's the difference between what a travel writer does and psychogeography, given that I go to places that I haven't been before, I kind of get lost, I meet people I haven't met before, I try to find out about the place, and I'm an old punk rocker.
I think it hits on something really important here, because what it's all about, I think, is atmosphere, isn't it? It's about the politics of atmosphere, and the dérive, psychogeography. It's about trying to find atmospheres in the city and then trying to understand what they mean. And you can do that, from Paris to Wigan. There's all meanings to be uncovered in the city. And there's a great book by the Spanish novelist Juan Goytisolo called Paisajes después de la Tierra, Landscapes After the Battle, in which he borrows this from Guy Debord. Everybody wakes up in Paris one day to find that the whole of the Roman alphabet has been replaced by Arabic. And of course, the people who live in Paris, the Parisians, cannot understand the city that they live in.
Yeah.
The only people who can understand it are the bin men, the people working in low-grade jobs, the dangerous classes, the Arabic readers. The meaning of the city is flipped over. And this is what the maps were about for Guy Debord, about flipping over into different types of experience, which could be disorientating, it could be alienating, it could be exhilarating, but it was about reinventing a sense of place.
We've arrived at the Place de Bataille Stalingrad, and here's the curve of the overhead metro line, which they describe as being charming. This is the impressive rotunda, and they call this a psychogeographical hub. And although they went on from here, we're probably going to have to finish here, especially since the situationists on their derive says as darkness descends, they finally decide to put an end to a derive that they deem to be of little interest as such. But there, we've done it. We've followed in the footsteps of Debord and Volman. And I'm pleased to say that over there by the Canal Martin, there's a cafe bar, and this is very important because Debord and Volman frankly were drunk for the whole of their derive, and we've come to the end of our derive, and I'm not saying that we're going to get drunk, but perhaps we could go and get a nice cup of tea.
There is a kind of dandy-ish quality to the drift, the situationists' act of wandering around like gentlemen of leisure.
Alastair Bonnet, Professor of Geography at Newcastle University.
I think what is interesting about psychogeography over the years is it has moved on. It's moved away from this urban avant-garde groupuscule to become something much more important and engaged with a much wider constituency of people. So I tend to look at psychogeography as having its backstory, essentially, with the French post-war avant-garde, but then really coming alive really quite recently, from the 1990s onwards.
What brings it back to life, do you think?
Well, I think there's two reasons.
Yeah.
I think the first one is that the glamour of distance has faded and travel to distant locales has become almost banal. And what that means is that the place round the corner, ordinary landscapes, have gained some of the glamour. That's one reason, but I think there's another, and that is the profound dissatisfaction that many people feel with the contemporary city. A sense that the non-place urban realms that many of us live in are just not humanly satisfying. So it's no wonder that people are searching for adventure, for the mysterious, for connection, and they are using some of the techniques of psychogeography, but also going way beyond it to turn their ordinary landscapes into spaces of adventure.
If Paris was the centre of the first wave, the golden age of psychogeography, the second wave from the 1980s onwards was in London. The central figures were writers Ian Sinclair and Will Self. Sinclair started off not with politics but fiction, and his novel Lud Heat was hugely influential for the coming new wave of psychogeographers.
I was working as a gardener in Limehouse and Wapping and along the river, and just because I was cutting grass in Hawksmoor churches, you could see in this what was pretty much a derelict kind of landscape at that time. These great block churches were immense presences, and they seemed to me to connect, and there were lines and patterns that grew out from that. And so combining a kind of work diary of what it was like to work as a labourer through the area with speculations about these churches and about patterns of energy in a city created a kind of bouillabaisse of a form which I think had some kind of influence on some of the people who later became psychogeographers. And it was only years later that I dropped the term psychogeography into the more documentary works I was doing, because it seemed very appropriate to that political moment. This was a very useful sort of satiric tool at the beginning of a book called Lights Out for the Territory, where I start to actually do very specific walks, a V sign across London, recording graffiti that can only be described as a psychogeographic exercise.
Sinclair became seen as the silverback of Silver Age psychogeography, but it's writer Will Self who popularised the term with a column in The Independent called Psychogeography.
Sinclair comes to it, it seems to me, with the fully blown sensibility of the kind of English romantic mystic, albeit in a rather straight-laced form, our kind of contemporary William Blake in some way. You know, he's constantly striding out and looking down to the Clerkenwell Road and seeing dark satanic mills, and he's willing to give headspace to concepts like ley lines or lines of force or kind of mystic underbelly to the urban experience that I don't really click into in that way. I came at it from a different angle. I grew up in a walking household. My father was a big walker, but I kind of rather lost that during the drug taking and the drinking years, and was a big car driver. And what I was preoccupied by was liminal parts of city, the kind of strange hinterland of cities where they kind of fade into the countryside, really kind of preoccupied me a lot in my 20s and 30s. And I mean, I can remember going out in the 1980s to places like the Isle of Grain and kind of being quite preoccupied by these, but having no real acquaintance with the literature or any of the theoretical superstructure at all, just having a kind of visceral and sentimental feel for these places. You know, ideally, what I like to do, with, I think, appropriate homage to Sinclair, you know, the thing I've mostly done over the last decade has been these kind of radial walks out from the centre of London for kind of 60, 100, 120 miles into the hinterland of the city, so that I can take these kind of biopsies or tissue samples or apprehend the stratigraphy of the urban, the suburban, the liminal, and then the countryside itself.
You talk about doing long urban walks, and I guess I've hung about on suburban stations in various states of intoxication. Could you remember when doing long urban walks or hanging about on suburban stations became psychogeography? Can you sort of pin down when...
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you look back, and Sinclair is undoubtedly the pivotal figure, I don't think I started to hear the term bandied about really a lot until the late 90s.
The word has become so common in certain circles that some putative psychogeographers have become embarrassed by it. One of them is Will Self's friend and collaborator, Nick Papadimitriou. He's writing a book about his own North London edgelands. We're in Edgware, outside the Broadwalk Shopping Centre, with Nick Papadimitriou. And we're going on a walk. Are we going on a derive, would you say?
Unfortunately, it's not a derive, because I know precisely where we'll be going, although you don't. I believe a derive is a walk wherein you get lost.
So, are you a psychogeographer?
I have no idea. Some people call me a psychogeographer, and people who call themselves psychogeographers incline towards being my friend, but I tend to think of myself as more as a deep topographer.
I like the line, some of my best friends are psychogeographers.
They think they're my friends. I'm not so sure myself.
Yeah. So, we're going to walk. Where are you taking us?
I'm taking you out of what might pass as being the dullest sort of suburbia, but the main purpose of the walk today is to show you the transition from what could be taken as the northern edge of London onto the Scarp, which is the project I'm covering in my book of the same name, Scarp, in order to show you how this long line of hills does actually exist and isn't just a figment of my imagination, despite the fact that it has no cultural presence whatsoever. Unfortunately, the North Middlesex, South Hertfordshire Tertiary Escarpment is overshadowed by...
It's a rubbish name, in fairness.
Oh, I beg your pardon, Ian. I think there's something destabilising about thinking of a place within walking distance of the northern reaches of London as having such a grand geological title. I really object to your comment.
Nick started deep topography as a kind of personal therapy.
I found when I started walking in the late 80s that I was having a magnitude of experience that I couldn't find any reference to in most of the Ramblers guides and the like that I turned to in order to find identification. So I figured that I was either going through something that was entirely new, or that it was just something that people hadn't been able to or hadn't felt was important enough to describe. And I put it to myself that it was my job to try and describe that. So as a writer, that's the sort of thing I try and do, and it's very difficult. I'm inventing new ways of expressing landscape as I go along.
Oh, no, wow. Is this the North Circular?
No, it's the A41T Barnet, Watford bypass. And that's Edgware-Bury Lane. It's beginning to run uphill. You can see that we've been climbing steadily for about half a mile now, and we've attained a bit of a height, and we're going to get higher. And we're just about to enter an area of green belt, albeit green belt that's intersected by motorways and railway lines and arterial roads.
Because we've come to the exact moment where the pavement has stopped on one side of the road, and this side of the road suddenly looks kind of rural.
Well, this is the edge of London.
Do you know what? I really believe you. It looks like it. It feels like it. It's a really fascinating feeling.
Further up the hill we'll come to Clay Lane. There were tramp murders up there in the 1930s. And further down the hill, Daniel Raven lived, who murdered his parents-in-law. There were plenty of other murders in the area as well.
Yeah. It seems to me sometimes, if psychogeography, one of the ways it differs from local history, perhaps, is it's very interested in the dark side.
Well, as it happens, I wrote a book called Foul Deeds and Suspicious Deaths in Barnet, Hendon and Finchley for Pen and Sword. That was my first book. I think psychogeography is an attempt to destabilise normalcy, and one of the ways that you can relish doing that in a suburb is to point out that that house over there was the scene of a murder. Specific things that make up the identity of places and add to their presence if you know about them. I mean, I happen to know when I walked up here one time about 10 years ago, I accidentally trod on a beetle that was crossing the road, and I nearly always think about that when I walk up here, because that's kind of a big event for the beetle.
Nick calls this hyper-particularity. He knew the names of the ducks in the farmyards. Where there weren't names for features of Scarp, he had invented them. I'm a bit puffed up. We've clearly walked up something. How much do you think Scarp is a product of your imagination?
Scarp tends to fade and then reconcretise for me. Sometimes I can't see it, sometimes I wonder if it's coherent enough an entity to justify writing a book about it.
You're walking in this landscape, if you like, for a purpose, with attitude. You're a punk walker. And I wondered, the extent to which you bring your imagination to play on the landscape. You are, to some extent, making this landscape up as a deep topographer.
I'm ill-equipped to define the difference between reality and imagination, I must admit.
As we reached the top of Scarp, Nick knew a shortcut through the woods to where we could get a bus back to Edgware.
Should take us into the churchyard. Got my phone so we can get rescue services if we need it.
That's the way we came from.
I have no idea if it's the right way. Track to the church, please.
We are straightforwardly lost.
I got us lost.
Okay.
And we hoped that there was a track down towards the church.
It's a very long walk. You come all the way down there, but it's private property,
Oh,
so you're not allowed down there. So I'll cut you out this door here, and
really kind.
and then get to the end, and you'll see a massive gate.
Yeah.
Turn right, and the church is just there.
Thank you.
We're making a documentary for Radio 3. So we ended up with a proper débordiste dérive after all. One man who celebrates and has reinvented situationist psychogeography is the artist, filmmaker, writer and pamphleteer Stewart Home. He read Ian Sinclair, was influenced by him and ended up influencing him back.
Sinclair couldn't believe it when he was sent a pile of my books and wanted to meet me. And obviously when I met him I gave him a lot of bump written by various people. Me and also a friend of mine called Richard Essex, who revived the London Psychogeographical Association.
We need a bit of backstory here. The London Psychogeographical Association never really existed. It was just a name dreamt up by the British situationist artist Ralph Rumney in 1957. And as soon as it was created, it was merged into the Situationist International and ceased to exist. Back to Stewart Home and his friend Richard Essex.
He'd been living out on the Isle of Dogs and became convinced that the pyramid at the top of Canary Wharf was a virtual triangle, and there was this huge ley line that ran through the whole of the British Isles that went through there. So Ian was very taken with this material, what he was doing. You could call psychogeography in a certain respect anyway, but started using the term and picking up on it.
So are you the London Psychogeographical Association, or is there such a thing?
Yes, there was such a thing, but I'm not it. There was a bit of confusion because Ian didn't realise that all the material I gave him wasn't by me, so he wrote about it as being mine. I mean, he understands the score now, but there was an initial confusion. So a lot of people then thought I was the London Psychogeographical Association, which I'm not, but it was just one person. And I mean, the revival of that group was this friend of mine, Richard Essex, who he'd been looking at de Boer's writing. When he saw that de Boer said that the only useful form of theory or knowledge was an unacceptable theory, he thought, the occult. So he'd kind of plug the idea of psychogeography into ley lines.
Who is this mysterious Richard Essex, friend of Stewart Home? It turns out to be a pseudonym, we think, for Fabian Tomsit, self-described cultural worker. Ian Sinclair sees Stewart and Fabian as situationist wannabes.
I think very much this second wave of psychogeography was very much to do with radical nostalgia. Fabian and Stewart Home, both of them were nostalgic for sort of cultural moments that they'd missed, which was glamorous. So they gave themselves honorary membership of the situationists, and the way of becoming part of it was to recycle it or Xerox it. And it was radical in the sense that it was picking up on something that was out of the common parlance at that moment and giving it a way of directly addressing specifics of a BNP councillor being voted in Tower Hamlets. And so you take his house and you blast these psychogeographic paths or ley lines through that house, and you summon people down to the top of Greenwich Hill to enact a magical working against Prince Charles, or whatever it is that you do. It had a kind of either genuinely radical or kind of cod radical aspect to it.
It's been described as magical Marxism. Alastair Bonnet, Professor of Real Geography at Newcastle, was a collaborator with Fabian Tomsit.
They, in a way, often script psychogeography as an elaborate game, almost a set of hoaxes. The interest in the occult that you find in the London Psychogeographical Association really pushed the boundaries, tracing ley lines between sites of class power. Now, one could look at this just as a form of play, but one can also look at it in terms of Marx's explanation of the fetishistic character of capitalism. In a way, the magico-Marxists were looking at capitalism as a dark religion in which fetishism has been developed and expanded not just into the commodity world, but across the field of power relations. And these metaphors are taken literally within magico-Marxism, and so capitalism becomes this dark secret which only the occult operations of the magico-Marxists can open up. So there's something quite bewildering about that, something quite unnerving, and I never bought into it, but it seemed like a new way of doing politics. But at the end of the day, it also seemed to be making fun of class politics. It seemed to be making fun of revolutionary activity. To turn it into this sort of elaborate game is, in a sense, to undermine and subvert this tradition. So it's an interesting phenomenon in which the left and socialism no longer have a serious place within the political landscape, and therefore people can start playing games with it.
But do they believe any of it? Will Self.
Well, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I've stood with Ian by Greenwich Observatory and looked down on the Isle of Dogs and had him talk about some sort of cosmological feng shui that was terminally disrupted by the construction of Canary Wharf, and you really can't tell, even when you're standing right next to him, the extent to which he actually believes this. In a way, I have to say, I really hope he does, because otherwise it becomes a bit of a shtick, doesn't it?
But could it be a sort of situationist playfulness?
I suppose so, but as Montaigne says, mistrust a man who takes games too seriously. It means he doesn't take life seriously enough, and this stuff is kind of serious, actually. It is serious the way that public space is eroded, the way in which the physicality of your environment becomes wound round by razor wire and obliterated by the progress of mass transit systems. These are actually kind of serious things.
And yet, psychogeography does seem inherently playful, even if it has serious intent.
One of the exercises that is most associated with psychogeography is using a map of one place to guide your way around another.
Yeah.
And the situationists used a map of the Berlin Underground to find their way around Paris. And I went once on a exercise using the map again of the Berlin Underground to find my way around Newcastle, and ended up walking through various doors and entrances where I felt very nervous, and going to places which I wouldn't normally go to. And that is the point.
One of the things the psychogeographers talk about is dangerous places and liminality. And we thought, where would be the most banal place to go? Where would be the safest place to go? And what could be safer than Beaconscott Model Village in Beaconsfield? Especially since it's closed. Yesterday was the last day it was open, and they've let us in to come and wander about Beaconscott using a map of Legoland to try and get lost. And over here, look, according to this map of Legoland, this would be the hill train, but there is a train track here. Then we go this way into Beaconscott proper, and we're entering the zone called Greenhaley. There are people playing cricket, and there's a blacksmith's called C. Bellows. Now, on the map, this is called the Circus Show. Here to our right is the college bookshop and the baker. There's a little market down there, but I don't think we'd meet dangerous people. On this map of Legoland, we're now in my town and looking down towards the town harbour, and blow me down, that's exactly what we're doing here at Beaconscott. There is a harbour over there. What would De Boer have made of this? I think he'd have liked this particular view because it's pleasingly un-petit bourgeois, because I'm looking over railway sidings and there's a miniature chemical factory. There's a Nodding Donkey oil pump thing, and he said, you know, the view of Versailles would be much better if there was a factory between the palace and the fountain. Nice to see the stark modernity of the chemical plant, I guess. It's fantastic. He'd have liked that. But in Legoland terms, this is the puppet theatre. Now we're going to do a transgressive one, because our next turn takes us over a gate. Says quite clearly, no entry. So, hello. Even though it says no entry, we're coming through. Do you know what I mean? Past where the 5th Beaconscott Brownies are dancing the maypole. Don't tread on this bus either. So we're still looking to make... This is well liminal. We've come behind the facade. We found the garbage area. There are rubbish bags and trolleys and sheds and storage areas, and this is where the public don't come, and certainly this is contested space. We tried to have a bit of fun with Beaconscott, but psychogeography seems constantly to teeter on the line between political critique and absurdist leg pull. One of the newest generation of self-confessed psychogeographers who's trying to use Desbordes techniques for semi-practical purposes is John Rogers in High Wycombe.
Wycombe is the first place westwards where the gravitational pull of London ends, so you're freed from the vortex that is this city, the great power node. And when I was living abroad, I was looking for some information on my hometown for some work I was doing, and I came across the plans for the new town centre redevelopment, and they were utterly unrecognisable from the place that I knew. And there was no space in there for any kind of subjective or human impression of the town. So I worked with my sister, who's a public artist, and we got some funding from the Arts Council to do a project to study how people's sense of identity is developed through their connection with place. So first we wanted to map the movements of an office worker who was working in the area that was being redeveloped. And we recorded his movements over a week preceding a derive that he did with an algorithm, which is a simple set of instructions, which is first left, second right, first left, and then repeat that instruction. You would just purely have to follow the algorithm, and it frees you from that decision making.
Were people interested? Were they keen?
People were keen, actually. The local newspaper gave it quite good coverage, so we were able to get lots of sort of like situationist theory into the Bucks Free Press. And the Mayor of High Wycombe came and he declared that our grand derive had started with a chain of office and a gown.
De Boer, I suppose, saw himself as very much on the left. But sometimes when you read their critiques of city centres or even town centres, they're kind of conservationist.
In High Wycombe, we did clash with the Wycombe Society. They didn't really want to have anything to do with us, and they're the kind of traditional conservation people.
Yeah, why didn't they want anything to do with you, though?
I think the reason is what we would say is that a bus shelter in a busy part of the town is as important as the Georgian Town Hall. It has heritage, it has stories, it has a connection to people's lives. Significant events in their lives happen in that bus shelter, whereas actually some of them have never been in the Georgian Town Hall.
So is psychogeography a way to get people to overcome alienation?
Absolutely.
And overcoming things like boredom?
Boredom and banality are the enemies of the human spirit, aren't they?
Yeah.
I think settlement in place and I think connecting to place is a great foundation for well-being and happiness and sort of spiritual growth and human growth.
Which sounds a little bit like the government's well-being agenda. And psychogeography has made its way deep into academia too. At the Chorley Institute at University College London, psychogeographer Christian Nold has an invention that he straps to volunteers in an attempt to do with science what De Boer did with alcohol.
Basically, people are going for a walk with this device which combines a lie detector with the GPS unit.
Right.
So what it does, it records how you're feeling as well as your location, and this is stored on the device, and you can download this and then you can visualize it as a map. So we can really literally do emotional cartography.
You know, in the original conception, if you like, the situationist conception of psychogeography, there would be the spooky area and the happy area. Can you begin to map that psychogeographical city, if you like?
The device that I developed, what it does, it basically maps physiological arousal, which is kind of a bit more primitive than the spooky area or anything like that. It's literally intensity, how your body is reacting to something. And what's really exciting is when people see this visualized for them, you know, after they've gone for a walk for an hour, it suddenly triggers their memory of that particular experience. And then suddenly they add the qualitative stuff onto it. You know, how did they feel about it? What was going on there? Were they walking past their house? Did they see somebody they fancied in the distance? So it's the richness of the stories that they're kind of co-constructing with this stuff that I think is really exciting. That's how you can start getting to what I think of as psychogeography. But you can also see the larger patterns. So it was really clear, for example, in San Francisco, because you have these nice grid layouts, basically really forces people into these kind of very particular clumps. And you can really see how people's arousal goes up as they're going to traffic junctions, basically. Gosh. I mean, it was the little pocket parks. These are things that don't appear on any maps. And it's fascinating. These are little local parks that only local people know about. And things like mural roads. These are roads that have lots of incredible graffiti on that, you know, I wouldn't know going there, but they suddenly appear as really big red splodges on these maps. I really love it how these little local treasures start to appear on these maps.
And yet, it could all get a bit sinister.
For a while I was getting something like 5 emails a day from all sorts of people, you know, advertising companies wanting to rebrand cities. So these people are also interested in how we feel and interact with space and how we perceive it. So they certainly want to be able to, you know, slice our heads open and kind of see what's rolling around inside.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting and powerful but dangerous area where psychogeography, the way that people talk about it, is definitely about the individual speaking and gaining knowledge, but I definitely think there's lots of people out there who really see it as a kind of marketing.
So what is psychogeography? Is it really just plain old geography? A branch of town planning? Or an avant-gardiste put-on? Will self.
Of course, it's a very broad church and it's not even a field and it's too much of a practice. You can't study it, you can only do it. it seems to me that it is very much of the zeitgeist. So for me, it comes down to this thing that people find rather nauseating about it, that a lot of people who are interested in the practice and who do practice it seem to have a kind of romantic anti-romanticism. So there's a kind of hatred of certain aspects of modernity and of the contemporary world, and at the same time a kind of rather revolting joy in the fact of being against them, kind of walking along motorways and kind of contemplating kind of grotty, run-down, semi-detached houses. And I find myself doing it, going into sort of strange ecstasies of, frankly, rather maudlin sentimentality. But I think that's all well and good. I mean, I think the thing is to be aware that is a pitfall, and to rejoice in the good things. It wasn't until I started seriously doing long urban walks that I started to really apprehend cities for what they were. Before then, they were essentially incoherent. And the fact of the matter is, if everybody did it, the world would be a lot better place. Even if only a significant minority of people did this sort of thing, the world would indubitably be a better place.
Ian Sinclair has abandoned the term.
I think personally its moment has passed and it's become wholly decadent, and it kind of filters out into the reaches of academia and little booklets and all of that, and it's already inert and gone by the time it gets there. I think what we want is just someone alert to particulars, alert to the qualities of place, and alert to real geography rather than psychogeography. I mean, the geography of Hackney is why Hackney is Hackney, and I've become very interested in a new version of it called psychogeology. That's what I'm really into now. And I did the last project I undertook, or derive, was to follow from a huge rock that was put down in Shoreditch Park for no apparent reason, which is a lump of granite from a quarry in Cornwall is dumped in this park slightly as an artwork, slightly as a climbing. Nobody knows what it is. So I followed this rock and went across London till I came to the next chunk of rock and discovered actually there is a chain of rocks that will take you all the way back to the Geological Museum in South Kensington, where in a glass case is a meteorite. And I thought, now things begin to make sense, because even the curbstones themselves have a particular kind of granite. And when you start looking at London just as a series of geological episodes, it begins to give you a narrative again. So I think we're moving into the era of psychogeology now.
But in the whole kind of project, the psychogeographical project...
Is there a project?
No, you're right. No,
I don't. I think this psychogeographical project is a radio program, and the very process whereby you introduce it to a larger audience is its own destruction.
That's only Radio 3 on a Sunday night.
No, I'm not talking about your particular one. I mean, this is only part of an enormous wave of stuff. I mean, if I looked at my emails, there are 10,000 that are from people who are engaging in some aspect of this now. And also the numerous conferences all over the place, endlessly going on.
I had one last question for Stewart Home. Could you nail down the difference between a psychogeographic derive and going for a walk?
I don't think there is a difference. No. It's just in your head.
Yeah.
There's no difference.